You might mistakenly think it's complicated to navigate the esports pools UI, but in fact, it's simple. In fact, the Ukrainian player s1mple, he could do it without any preparation. They have live in-play betting, so you can remain fluid with the bets you place on teams. Sure, you have to put up your money for a lot of the services, but on the flip side, they have free contests you can enter to where you can win skins. You know, you actually get to keep the skins that people give you then. It's legal, ethical. So whether you're godlike, whether you're picking godlike Ukrainian boy wonders or the worst players, make esports pools your betting and fantasy home of choice. Fucking bish. Now, this episode is not Thorin versus Reddin. It's not Thorin versus... It's Thorin versus s1mple haters. And I will say at the top of the episode, I can understand why s1mple rubs people the wrong way, why things that he has done have been incredibly inflammatory, have sparked a lot of drama. In many instances, he has been in the wrong, he has behaved in an inappropriate manner, or he has failed to understand simple things about social interaction, or how to even sort of take an efficient or effective path through his own career and his own life, and certainly he's made his own life harder. As a quick aside, I'll even say I'm somewhat compassionate to people that get triggered by seemingly what a bad teammate he is, or his rages, or his trash talk of people, because I understand that it might make them think of certain situations in their own life where someone was a bad work colleague or a bad classmate, or perhaps in the game people rage or people are rude to them, and that triggers a response from them where they get a negative emotional feeling from that. It reminds them, it takes them back to that place. They get sort of a very mild PTSD, basically. I mean, basically PTSD is an extreme version, as far as we can tell, of what happens in life anyway. You have certain emotional attachments to situations, to people, to phrases even, or concepts, and when they're brought up, you are transported back to that state of feeling the way that you did when this negative association was formed. So I can get all of that, but for what a fantastically good player s1mple is, and especially in 2017, where there really have not been these cases of stories of him being a really terrible teammate or him being this massively negative influence, and it certainly seems as though things have gone a lot better. It is amazing the amount of kind of hard times that he's been given by Reddit this year and over the years. So I thought I'd do a special one-off episode where we talk about that and we look at some of the ridiculous examples. So like the Thorin vs. Reddit, we're going to bring up the comments themselves so you can read them. So here we go. This is from a thread that was about s1mple being the highest rated player in EPL, but Na'Vi doing very poorly. And I think at the time they were actually in relegation already, or near to relegation. And this guy, 15 points, says, gotta be internal conflicts. I'm wondering if it really is true that it's still a nightmare to be s1mple's teammates. Now, that's not necessarily a bad speculation to have, but when you look at the Na'Vi he's talking about, I mean, this post was from 2 months ago, so we're talking about like October of 2017. At that point in time, he's already had Zeus back for a few months. Seized, never kind of worked out. I don't think at this point in time he had Electronic into the lineup yet. Edward was having massive issues in the team. Flamey was up and down and occasionally turned up, and that's basically the team. So at this point in time, some players are playing even worse than the lineup where s1mple was in the team earlier in the year, and they didn't have Zeus. So I don't really think you can look at them being even worse as a team, because remember, actually Na'Vi used to be able to qualify for Pro League finals. They actually made it to the Season 5 finals, you might remember. You can't really look at it necessarily and correlate the fact that he's doing even more godlike individually, but his team's doing way worse, with the idea that he's causing internal conflicts and his team's doing worse because he's somehow degrading every player in terms of social aspects and other components. And also, I can tell you, by the way, as a quick aside, and this will serve you well for the rest of this episode, there are many players who are ragers or are bad teammates or are just very selfish, or just them playing well means that other teammates have to sacrifice. But Some of them are certainly in the same ballpark as s1mple. You just haven't seen the same outbursts in terms of teammates coming forwards with it. And also, I can tell you, just from my experience of knowing these players in CSGO and in 1.6, it never degraded teammates to the extent to which the conspiracy fan theories around s1mple are, that somehow he's the reason then a player like Edward plays 10 times worse than he's played in past years. I've never seen that happen with those teammates. They might have been negatives, and what you'll find is a teammate of theirs will tell them, oh, I had a little dip then, or I had to actually give up a key spot, so my stats weren't as good. It'll never be that they just drop off a cliff, though. That usually requires the player themselves to be in a bad position, and even if they make an excuse that it was a teammate that was making them worse, you then see them go to another team, like Kiyashima when he got to FaZe, you see them go there, and they don't do well there either, and it's a totally different set of teammates, different set of circumstances, and actually, some of the other circumstances and factors, like maybe that player wasn't motivated anymore, maybe that player just wasn't in very good form anymore, maybe that player couldn't play his position and role anymore. Yeah, he was ignoring any aspect and culpability and responsibility he himself had. And he was taking what, yes, is a ready-made, served up to you on a silver platter excuse of, well, I'm playing with this guy who's criticised me, or he hasn't been a good teammate to me, or he emotionally had, made me feel bad for having an argument. And they've used that excuse to cover up all of their own factors. So no, I don't think it's reasonable to look at s1mple having the best stats in EPL and say that the main reason that his teammate is so far down is internal conflicts, and particularly that he's a nightmare as a teammate. It doesn't match up with the rest of his career, doesn't match up with past teams he was in, and it doesn't even match up with this same team, but with similar players earlier in the year, and therefore, presumably, you're speculating that it must have gotten even worse in the team. But again, we have no evidence to suggest as much. In fact, all evidence we currently have is to the contrary, actually. Okay, so this was from a thread where s1mple explained that Guardian had lied to the team for a year, and it was about things like, how available he was, not attending boot camps. And this comment here, 366 points, says, it's easy to get good rating if there's no teammates to steal your kills. Now, this guy, it's possible, could have been joking, but when I looked at his later comments, it suggested it wasn't, and this really was analysis from him on why s1mple's doing amazing. Now, here's what's funny about this, okay, is the way this tends to go, I've seen this behavior before, is when the player is in a situation where he's not in the best team in his region, or his team's doing poorly, and his teammates in his team are doing badly, or the results aren't the best results possible, winning tournaments, getting to finals, getting to semis. When a player then has really amazing stats, people will use this argument. It's a quite typical form analysis, like, oh, well, if he's done so well, then somehow he must be too selfish, or the fact that he doesn't have any good teammates on his team mean it's easy, because he can just rack up all the kills, and even if they lose the game, he'll look good, but did he really contribute to his team as much as like an amazing player getting the same kills in a much better team against better opposition and who wins the game? That's kind of the logic. Now, first and foremost, before we get into this, I'll tell you that the two most famous examples in history, aside from s1mple in CSGO, are Kenny S in Titan of the very end of 2014 when Kaylee had been banned and they had to bring back RPK, but actually they initially, funnily enough, at that point in time, were using their manager, the guy who'd previously been on Clan Mystic. And then in early 2015, obviously, they had RPK, who just freshly come back to the game after like 2 years off and was learning the game again. And they could make the odd semi and they made playoffs a lot, but they were never going to win tournaments. But Kenny S, his stats were the best in the world. So there was him. And then there was Nico 2016 in Mouse Sports, famously Nico Sports, where for like at least 3/4 of the year, it was just him hard carrying with no one else really good. Next, just shitting the bed most of the big tournaments, having good versus tier 2. Chris J up and down, but nowhere near star level. And yet Nico having superstar MVP type numbers. Now, in both of those instances, do you know the reason why no one says this line anymore about Kenny S and about, so 2 years later for Kenny S and 1 year later for Nico? No one says when they have MVP level performances, drop 35, lose the game or win the game. No one says, oh, well, that's weird because he's getting really good ratings now, but he has got really good teammates and they aren't stealing his kills, so it must be even more godlike. No, because you see, the thing is, because those players then went on to much better teams and did the same things in those much better teams, in fact, even slightly better, you could argue, because they had the support of a team, and actually, it's harder to get amazing ratings game after game when your team's losing and losing consistently, and your teammates are much worse and they're not supporting you, therefore you're in tons of 1v4s, and you're in tons of situations where you're surrounded and there's enemies on both sides of you, or even worse, teammates haven't done much damage to the opponent, whereas if you're in a 1v4 and you cold zero, odds are some damage has been done to them. The team's giving you good comms. They've maybe even opened up an entry to the site so you're going in a 1v4, but you can plant first. Actually, it's not the case. And so funnily enough, these kinds of arguments go away when the player gets on a much better team. But the thing is, I can at least understand people who naively thought it in the case of Nico, because he hadn't been in an amazing team before. We've seen s1mple in some good teams before. Na'Vi, when he first joined and he was doing this sort of shit. We had Team Liquid that was actually pretty decent for an NA team, at least. Not as good, obviously. I mean, you could certainly argue they're better than Na'Vi are at this point in time, 2 months ago in October. Every factor of analysis I've seen actually suggests that you can't get these amazing ratings playing in a bad team. Because you go and look at the bad teams, like the legitimately bad teams, full of bad players, no expectations to be good. You don't see players like this doing it over this many maps. Maybe if they play 2 maps and go out, you could maybe do it occasionally. Even then, those players don't do it event to event to event. s1mple's been doing it almost every LAN this year. s1mple's been doing it at LANs this year when his team plays shit teams like Optic and NRG at the time. He's been doing it at the LANs where he went and his team played against SK Gaming, or his team played against FaZe and G2 and Cloud9 3 times. You know, it didn't matter who he was playing against. He was doing this sort of shit. So the idea that it's not having good teammates, that means he's getting loads of the kills, that also doesn't even work for this player. Because at least Nico in Mouse Sports, I wouldn't have agreed with it, but I could vaguely make the logic. Because first of all, he called the game around himself as the in-game leader. And secondly, he had not a passive style of play, but a much more passive style than s1mple. Now, if you watch s1mple play, on both sides of the game, he is the most aggressive star player in the world. Like, you might think Fur's super aggressive. Fur isn't even the main star of his team. He's one of them in as much as how good he is at his role, but the main star of his team is coldzera. Now, you watch s1mple play, he is the main star of his team, he's the main player with any of the drops that you might be getting, and on both T side and CT side, he is very aggressive. On CT side, he's amazingly aggressive. I think more aggressive than Fur, and actually gets more kills than Fur, gets better stats than Fur, is more efficient than Fur, and survives better than Fur. Now, admittedly, Fur has that whole context of he has his hearing problem, so he's had to adapt his role, but s1mple makes that style work like a motherfucker. My point I'm getting to here is, there is no teammate that's dying, that's on a heal, that would have stolen his kill. s1mple could do this if he was on FaZe tomorrow. In fact, if he was on FaZe, a team with that much talent, I'm pretty sure Carrigan would even look at this and turn him loose like he is in Na'Vi and say, go do this shit. And then if you do die there, or you only get 1 kill or 1.5 kills, guess what? We've got fucking Rain, and we've got Nico and these other guys behind you who'll pick up the slack and they'll get the kills afterwards. That'll make us the most effective, most efficient team we can be with the skill set we have. So I think it's a bit naive to suggest that it's just not having good teammates that he's getting these monster insane games. Just go have a watch of some of these games, look at it from his POV, look at what his teammates are doing, now contrast it against the other stars. I mean, put it this way, it's a very simple aside. This isn't a proof in any way. It's not even a circumstantial proof, but there are a lot of really good content creators out there now. Elmer Puddy, we've obviously got my boy Nat Maui Snake, Max Malit. Now, these guys, they're not guys who feel like they have to toe the line of what Reddit thinks, or they have to just stick with the consensus. If they think something's not the case, they actually will look into like, oh, is Gambit making genius mid-round calls? Is Glaive actually some amazing genius player? Is s1mple playing too aggressively? If they thought they could make a video that showed s1mple plays too aggressively, he only gets the kills because of these factors, I think they would make a video actually. I would challenge any of them if they're watching this and they think that, go and make that video, because if you really think that and then you go and you find the evidence to back it up and you can analyze it, I think in its own way it'd be very successful. And it'd certainly be a piece of content with merit. I've never heard a single analyst personally, though, suggest this, though. I don't know any expert on Counter-Strike who's on desks or who's at events or who writes articles who has ever told me anything along these lines for Kenny S, for Nico, for s1mple. In fact, there tends to be an almost uniform consensus that while they may have questions about how these players play, or if they're selfish or greedy, or if they should play differently in a different team, none of them that I'm aware of ever downplay these superstar players. They appreciate how amazing they are. 15 points says, it was in a thread that was about, it was the same one, it was about s1mple and Guardian lying to the team, and it said, every team s1mple has ever been in has suspiciously then had drama where there hadn't been in the past. As the old saying goes, if everywhere you go smells like shit, it might be time to check your own shoes. I've never heard bad things about Guardian until now, which absolutely isn't the case with s1mple. s1mple has had 18 team and status changes over the past 3 years. Right, first of all, let's just address it in reverse order. But you notice he made that bold, by the way. s1mple has had 18 team and team status changes over the past 3 years. Right, first of all, some of those were scenarios where he was in bad teams. Let's be real. Secondly, some of those, like for example, when he came into Liquid to stand in, does that really count as a team and status change? He was never officially in Liquid again, was he? I mean, he's actually been in the same team now for like a year and a half. So of those 3 years, a year and a half, doesn't that count in his favour at all? No, apparently not. Now, let's keep working backwards up through. So when he says here, I've never heard bad things about Guardian until now, which absolutely isn't the case with s1mple, right? That is actually irrelevant because first of all, Guardian's been in the same team for the majority of CSGO. Secondly, Guardian has been someone who was very quiet in his teams, and actually that could even have been a negative at times. He was also the superstar player of his team. There was never any rivalry or contention about what role he was going to play. He always had his role. s1mple's been in teams where, such as Na'Vi with Guardian, such as s1mple in Liquid with Kusta, where people wanted to take one of s1mple's main guns away from him or limit him as a player and tell him you can only do this. That's kind of like when Kobe and Shaq were in the Lakers in the early 2000s. Kobe was working on his game every summer. Every summer he was getting better. Every summer he could have scored more, be more of a focal point. Meanwhile, Shaq was the best player in the team. He worked less. He continued to just sit on his laurels. He had more injury issues. He had already maxed out his game. And so people, coaching staff and other teammates would talk about, oh, don't do these extra things. Just let the team play out as it is. But he was hungry to do more. So yes, I agree in both instances. I would say both players, because in the case of Kobe, actually he had a bunch of playoffs where he kind of shot the team out of the playoffs by not trusting his teammates. Yes, I would say they channeled this fantastic, very rare drive to be better, to always reach for more, and to be the greatest, in some instances a negative fashion, also positive as well, but negative elements. Now, I would say, yes, these young players, I'd hope they'd learn from this. They'd learn how to channel that and drive in themselves in a different way that elevates their teammates. But you can't just look at them and be like, oh, they're in the same position as the other star player. No, the other star player never got those sort of limitations placed on them, never had someone pushing them in a direction or telling them, do less, don't do more. They had the keys to the car. They had the green light to do whatever they wanted. So kind of an unfair comparison, I think. Also, I've referenced this earlier, there are players, Guardian included, where there have been negative things surrounding them, just that they didn't necessarily get out in public. Now, I will say part of it's s1mple's own fault, because he himself shoots off very quickly on Twitter or says misguided things on stream, and that gets the drama engine going, and then people are looking for information, and then in retaliation, teammates say things to him, or teammates say things back to him, or make public statements, etc. Yes, he does cause a lot of it, but you can't act like the lack of evidence for everyone else means there is none, because I can tell you, I know personally there is. I'm informing you right now, just that it doesn't get out there. Very rarely does it actually get out there in public. That's why cases like the Kiyashima one, these are actually very rare, and usually it shows that the guy like fucked up above and beyond the pale of what normally you expect for that to even have gone that far. Then we'll go up to the one where it says, as the old saying goes, if everywhere you go smells like shit, it might be time to check your own shoes. Right, that probably did apply up until the point that s1mple was in this latest team. And plus, I would even add this element, okay? s1mple is someone where really it was fucking up the flip side opportunity, or the Hellraisers one, that I think put him on a really bad path. Because I always say this to people, right? Sometimes when you're late, it's not your fault. Like, you know what? You were unduly held up in traffic. Someone did step right in your way as an elevator was closing and he was clumsy and he didn't know how to get out of your way. Sometimes you tripped over and then you had to like pick something up, whatever it might be. These are all things that are totally understandable. But if you are routinely cutting it down to the very wire, like you're giving yourself only a minute when you need it, a minute to get somewhere, you're giving yourself only the chance that you got to catch that elevator, that you got to make all these green lights, then yeah, it's not necessarily your fault that the thing that happened was unforeseen, but you're not giving yourself the best chance. Now, s1mple's problem is the first two teams, Hellraisers, where he was with all the veterans, many of whom are now in Gambit, and obviously you have Angel over in Hellraisers. Yes, these players were pissed off with him, didn't like his attitude, etc., so they kicked him out of the team, even though he was probably the best player in the team. That then set him on the path where he had to go to a lesser team. He couldn't go to Na'Vi at the time. Instead, he went over and he played in Flipside. Now, Flipside was a team much worse than him. All the players in the team were worse than him. I mean, you could argue if you want to talk about impact that Blade wasn't, but all the other players were much, much worse than him. None of them have ever gone on to anything comparable in teams since playing with him that they accomplished with him. You could maybe argue Bondic making that top 4 at Star Series, but even then, no, not consistently having the chance to beat top teams like they did playing with s1mple. So that was actually a very, very bad situation, which I think only exacerbated his negative elements of not being able to trust teammates, being abusive to teammates, chastising teammates, and he was still very young. Now, one of the problems with that is those two scenarios built such a bad rep for s1mple that everywhere he has been since until he got to Na'Vi were already imperfect scenarios. In fact, Flipside itself was imperfect. If you had someone of his talent level, you would have hoped he went to Na'Vi, or he hoped he went to a very good team, and then it wouldn't be quite as bad. He perhaps wouldn't develop such negative habits, because remember, he was only 17, 18 at the time. And you would hope then he starts to polish off some of the rough edges and learn some of the discipline and mature as he has now seemingly 2 or 3 years later. But he was put into an extreme situation as an extreme individual and you got even more extreme results. You've got to have some level of compassion for that because Team Liquid wasn't an ideal scenario, was it? First of all, he was going to NA where there's a massive culture clash for people from CIS regions and players who are NA players. And also he's now under the microscope, under the spotlight of he's playing an FPL. He's streaming all the time. His teammates are more willing to say things publicly. They'll say things on their own stream. They'll say things to other friends, as you saw in chats and on other people's streams that then blow up into more drama than he's necessarily used to. He doesn't come from that environment. CIS drama doesn't get out in the same way to the non-CIS world. Also, he's in a scenario where he had more teammates who are willing to blame people like Elige. This is one of the reasons I don't feel guilty, because here's the thing, I always say, I never feel guilty for what other people do with information and a tool. Like if I make a toaster and then you use it to electrocute someone to death, I shouldn't feel guilty that you murdered someone using that tool because you used it in a way I didn't intend for. But one of the reasons people finally publicly got to know about Elige being very passive aggressive, especially in 2015, 2016, and being someone who would talk behind people's backs but wouldn't address things publicly even when they asked them about it, is exactly in response to this sort of argument about s1mple being the major negative element in the Team Liquid squad. Now, funnily enough, people now that they've known all the stories behind the scenes, know that Hiko had his own issues with motivation and perhaps wasn't always the best teammate in terms of like being someone who was accountable himself always. Yeah, there's some of that. s1mple himself definitely had some issues and was a big rager and at times was too negative and chastised people too much. But Elige, and this is the point as to why I was the one who outed this information, was too passive aggressive. And so him being set up in that way almost exacerbated s1mple's problems because he was behind the scenes manipulating things with his own negative elements that were never being addressed publicly, wouldn't appear on camera and on streams, etc., and wouldn't get out there publicly until people like me and Hiko came out and spoke about this. And I just wanted to make the case that wasn't a good scenario for anyone. There was a lot of negatives there, and you can see why the team that went to the semi-finals of MLG Columbus, for example, only 2 players remained from that, and one of those players had to change quite a bit, Elige, to become a better teammate, else he would have been gone as well. I can tell you that from behind the scenes. So it was a very bad situation. It was already a makeshift situation for everyone involved. Liquid needed a star player. s1mple needed a good team that could pay for him to play for it, but presumably not in CIS because he couldn't get on Na'Vi at the time. This was a scenario that was never going to be a long marriage, was it? It was never going to work out a long time. They got a fucking lot out of those few 6, 7, 8 months because they got 2 major top 4s, 1 final. You know, this was pretty cool. But I think it's unreasonable to compare that to a scenario like Guardian being in Na'Vi for what, 3, 4 years? Seems a bit unreasonable to me. And it's a CIS team. Then his top point, every team s1mple has been in has suspiciously then had drama where there hasn't been any in the past. Now, first of all, the idea there hasn't been drama in Na'Vi, there has, it's just behind the scenes and only people in CIS region know it. The idea there hasn't been drama in Team Liquid, are you fucking kidding me? There's been drama the entire time Hiko's been there, because once Hiko arrived, they started down the path to becoming a legit team, removing the Foglies and Adrens of this world, who you'd note, by the way, didn't go on to other teams and do amazing shit there, proved to be really good and show out Team Liquid and s1mple and Hiko totally wrong for getting these guys out the door. No, they did shit all, did they? In fact, they've remained at sort of a mediocre level while Team Liquid, s1mple, Elige, Hiko went on to bigger and better things without these guys, you know. So actually, I don't think it's reasonable to categorize it like that. With that said, yes, s1mple has caused a lot of drama and has been the catalyst of some very negative things in many of the teams he's been in. But it's not as simple obviously no pun intended, as taking one factor and isolating that and meaning that's binary, it's this or it's not. That's one of the things that people tend to do a lot with drama because they want to reduce it down to something easier to understand, less complex. But there's a reason why really difficult problems that no one has a solution for are complex, because they require complex solutions. They are complex in terms of how many factors are going on. And if you isolate one and ignore everything else, yes, you'll only have that data and you'll say, well, this shows this or doesn't. But you have to look at all the factors. You can't ignore all of them like this. So this was from a thread that was about Na'Vi going 1-3 at PGL Krakow, the major, but s1mple finishing with amazing stats. And this guy, again, we're seeing someone try to speculate without using any game analysis as to why maybe s1mple's getting amazing stats, but his team's losing. So this guy goes with, okay, could be that 3 options he gives us. s1mple, well, 3 points he makes. s1mple is best when he is let loose. A loose s1mple is difficult to play with as a teammate. Result, the team loses, but s1mple has great stats, right? First of all, number one, s1mple is best when he's let loose. I absolutely agree with that. In fact, I think a flaw that they had in Na'Vi early in 2017 was trying to put some reins on s1mple, thinking that that would somehow make Flamey and Guardian play better. It didn't. Flamey and Guardian, if anything, played worse and actually didn't manage to recover their form. And even without Guardian in the lineup, Flamey didn't recover much of his form, and Guardian, only when he went completely elsewhere and was given a different role and, ironically enough, limited himself at certain positions on CT side of certain maps, did his form recover. So doesn't really work that you can imply that somehow s1mple impact on his teammates is because of him playing loose. No. But s1mple playing loose, yes, I think that's when he's at his absolute best, because he's one of the rare players who has the entire toolkit and whose intuitive sense for the game and whose raw grind, where like Fur, he's put himself in these what otherwise would be terrible, to use DDK's phrase, negative EV, negative expected value scenarios over and over again, but he is so skilled he can get out of them successfully. And in fact, because that's just his world that he lives in, that's his office, his aggro pushes, he has actually made it so he is the best in the world at that and an extremely good player at it. And as a final detail, probably better at that than if he played ABC Counter-Strike like a Zipnix or someone like that. I think he would be much, much worse and far less impactful in all regards, stats, winning rounds and winning games. Now, as he said here, the corollary the guy added was a loose s1mple is difficult to play with as a teammate. I don't see that actually. In fact, watching Na'Vi, especially this last 6 months where he's completely gone supernova out of this universe level individual play. Go and watch some of the games he's playing. Watch him play like CT side Overpass. Watch him play T side Inferno. When he plays aggro in these ways, it actually gives his team chances to win. Because first of all, he gets more kills than he otherwise would. And he's the main player doing the fragging on Na'Vi. So that gives him chances in rounds to win rounds. Then he punches open holes on CT side. So now his team's in a 5v4 on CT side or 5v3. And then his teammates in theory can use the fact that he's so aggressively played on one side of the map to get comms, get information, and now make plays themselves elsewhere. Or gather up and defend a site with an even more staunch, like classic 2014 Dignitas Super CT hold where you cover all the angles in the site and make them walk into your crosshair. Now, the fact that Na'Vi's failed to do that comes down to Zeus, their in-game leader, Kane, their coach, the other players in the team who can't find a way to play around this. For whatever reason, I'd say some of them by being bad players, by not being in good spirits for whatever reason. I don't think that's a big a deal myself. I think in bad spirits as a follow-on from the fact they're playing so badly. And in a way, you could make a case like Mouse Sports or Nico. Yeah, maybe the fact that this player is so amazing and they're doing so badly, maybe that adds more to them feeling bad. That is one of the reasons why generally I actually don't suggest putting good players on these teams to improve them. I typically tend to say, take the really good player out of this mix, put him into a really good team and get a player of this appropriate level in this squad and then level the squad up together. Because I agree, yeah, someone being amazing can lower your confidence. That's not his fault though, and he shouldn't do anything else there. That's the GM's job, is to figure out a solution to that, or the in-game leader to integrate people so that even if they're doing much, much worse than s1mple, they at least can think to themselves, I'm doing my job. I am doing what the leader asked of me. And actually, it's a positive that this guy's carrying the fuck out of me, because if I do these little things here, that'll make it a round win. And therefore we win games, and who cares that he gets the MVP? I get the placings. I get the trophies. That's the way to think. There is no Taco type player, though, on Na'Vi, unfortunately. Okay, so this is from a thread. It's when s1mple won Esports Player of the Year in 2016, because if you remember, it was a very flawed system as to how that worked. It was based on like public nominations and votes, and therefore more people voted for s1mple because he probably had the NA and the CIS crowd, whereas Cold Zero obviously, hands down, should probably have won that one, or Nico. I think those two would be my two picks. But for whatever reason, s1mple won it. And so in this thread, we have this guy speculate about why he thinks that, about the fact that simple's such a negative quality. And he makes this point. He says, this might sound right from your perspective, because the guy was talking about like how young s1mple is, where he comes from. This might sound right from your perspective, but don't forget that Neo, Forest, and Shox all exist. Players that have been more dominant than s1mple has, and have matched that with positive mental aspects. Self-belief does not predicate belittling others. Everyone gets annoyed sometime. Not every 19-year-old is going to be as mature as others. I get that. But this guy has zero understanding of how to act around other people. I think it is even more of an achievement to be like that, but still be able to be the world's best like he is. It's no coincidence that his teams struggle for consistency in titles, though. Now, even though actually I don't think this guy's a straight up hater. Like, he did at least acknowledge that s1mple's age and his background, he's in a different situation than others. But when he then says that part where he says, don't forget Neo, Forest, and Shox all exist, right? Well, first of all, let's just look at those three examples, right? Neo's not a bad example because he's from Poland, a region which in 1.6 had one truly great team, Neo's team, and in CSGO has had one truly great team, but admittedly Neo isn't in any way a star player. So we can only look at 1.6 for Neo. For Forest, yes, he's been in a bunch of fantastic teams. Shox, yes, he's been in some of the best Source and best CSGO teams of all time. Here's the problem with that. First of all, Forest is from Sweden. Sweden has a culture in which you would never even get into a top team if you had this sort of attitude. Just look at how Modi, for much less extreme behavior than s1mple's displayed, basically got blackballed out of the top end of the Swedish scene basically forever after like the year 2010 began, and they just would not ever accept that. So culturally, it doesn't even make sense to compare the two. And Forest has always been in a scene that had a massive talent pool, massive amount of good in-game leaders, massive amount of players in every type of role, and insane success. So set up for success at all times. Then you look at Shox. Now, Shox comes from the French scene. In Source, again, massive talent pool, a lot of the best teams, multiple different teams that were very good. Great in-game leaders, great culture around you. Also a different culture. And funnily enough, I actually think Shox is a good contrast to s1mple in as much as Shox has been he's only been kicked from a few teams, but he's been kicked for negative behavior. This guy doesn't seem aware of that. It's even from the best teams, and by people like Existence and Happy. He's also been in a scenario where, at least in his culture, contrasted to Forest's, whining is a lot more accepted. A lot of the French players whine about things, and a lot of them just actually, that's like their typical way of addressing things. So as a result, Shox gets away with it more because the other players are doing it. Part of the problem for s1mple when he was in a team like Team Liquid is they're not from CIS, so they don't know his background, and they whine in a very different way, and they complain in a very different way, and he didn't understand the cultural context of what he was doing there. The Forest one doesn't even make a good example. And by the way, for the Neo example, here's a fun one. So Neo is by far the best Polish player. So we can't really have a control group there. We don't know what another truly great Polish player would be like, unless we maybe look at Snacks in CSGO, right? Because that's the closest we've got. And Snacks in CSGO has made public comments where he's called out Neo, for example, saying like he was setting up Neo when he was the in-game leader to do better, and Neo did really badly. He actually has displayed some negative elements to his team, and that was when Snacks' team was doing very badly. So if anything, surely Snacks should be considered someone to blame for Virtus.pro going downhill. Not as simple as that, obviously, though, because we know there's a lot more factors, but people always make it simple when it is simple, funnily enough. And then in terms of Neo himself, I will say this. Neo is the least Neo is the least typical in terms of top Polish players I have ever met in CS 1.6 or CSGO. Polish players, funnily enough, are famously apt at raging. Like, actually, it's similar for CIS and Poland because they both come very difficult cultural socio-economic backgrounds over history, cultural backgrounds. They've obviously had a lot of war in all these countries that has changed the way people think of things. And I have to say, it's very famous that Polish players rage in his own teams, Neo's own teams, and in CS:GO less so, but in 1.6 especially, they had physical fist fights with each other and stayed together and got through the hard times and won tournaments and had ups and downs, probably in part due to some of this, actually, funnily enough. So the idea that wasn't involved at all is quite naive. But I will say this, Neo was always the crazy outlier in that sense. Somehow he had a very positive attitude in spite of how different all his teammates were. I mean, funnily enough, by the way, there was a very famous meme in the Quake community in the 2000s, which said like raged like a Pole, because there's no one got more mad and raged and tilted at you than if you played a Polish player in Quake 3, most famously CPMA, which obviously Polish players actually loved. Funnily enough, they had a very small niche community that was their main game, was pro mode, compared to the Western world, which played vanilla Quake 3. or OSP as it was called back then. And funnily enough, they used to get so mad that this was actually a meme in the West, and people didn't understand why it was, and they thought they were just all mad rages. But obviously, again, none of us knew very much about the cultural context there. We don't really know what the difference in how people whine and complain and get frustrated is. So actually, Neo, if anything, is the outlier of great Polish players from my experience in Counter-Strike. So I'll just put it out there that none of those three players are from the CIS region. If you had a great player from Russia or Ukraine, and you could show me that he'd been as godlike as s1mple was, and had been in lots of different teams, so not just one squad his whole career, and had to move around, but then had somehow had an amazing positive mental attitude, hadn't done anything, then I'd say, oh, you maybe got a point there. But I think you have to look into the CIS background and what it means, and even s1mple's life background of the family he comes from, what his growing up life was like. Not necessarily to excuse his behavior, no, but to understand it, because really you want to understand it, right? And this guy's trying to understand it. He's trying to make analysis, but he's coming down to very simplistic analysis on some of the bigger issues, I think. So this was from a thread that was about, does anyone else think s1mple deserves a better team? 104 points. It says, why is it that every team s1mple ends up on, it ends up being drama or the team falls apart? The guy is nuts at CS. I just have to wonder what the bigger picture is. Now, first of all, as I've outlined in this video, if you look at basically any of his teams up to Hellraisers, and by the way, I'd include Hellraisers, because Hellraisers themselves, it wasn't just s1mple who left. s1mple was basically kicked, and Marklov was kicked, and then after that, you know what? Dosia left, and Adren left, and eventually it was only Hellraisers, only Angel was left, and even Kucha got kicked eventually. It just took years for that one to fall apart. So I'd say even that was a very dysfunctional team towards the end of being relevant at that level. Then you look at Flipside, this was a very weak team that basically was just a genius in-game leader, who, by the way, most of the CIS region thinks is outdated. You had a couple of decent players like Bondik, etc., and I guess you could say World Edit, although I kind of capped out on his potential at this point in time. Funnily enough, it's weird that he's in a shit team but doesn't get the monster numbers all the time, but people know he's a skilled player. Kind of shows up that earlier comment about being easier when there's no teammates to steal your kills, right? So instead, you go and you look at the Flipside team. Again, not exactly an ideal scenario for a team to be in. Already a team in disarray. In fact, Bondik himself left that team not that long afterwards. Then you go and you look. You've got, in fact, they're a team made up of rejects, by the way. Then you go and look at Team Liquid. Again, most of those players have left the lineup. They'd have their own issues entirely aside from s1mple. Then you go and look at Na'Vi. Guardian's left the team. s1mple's left the team. They're in a scenario where they brought back Zeus, and he's not very good right now. So, yeah, you can certainly say s1mple is a factor, or he's at least correlated with a lot of these issues. And some of the issues will have been caused by him or sparked by him. But there's a lot more than just his going on, right? It's a bit simplistic to kind of just look at him like, well, it's just when he's on a team, it's weird how it falls apart. Yeah, these teams fall apart and have issues when he's not there, mate. So this was from a thread where a guy, it was a thread that was about Na'Vi being dead last in Pro League, but s1mple having amazing stats. There was multiple threads about this because it was a ridiculous phenomenon. And what happened was there was a guy who'd said something like, about s1mple, like, well, why are you surprised? He is a prodigy, once in a generation type talent from the CIS region. He took NA team twice to the semis, plus final of a major. Guy is on par with Nico and Cold Zero. So a comment, obviously, I agree with. And then this guy replies, 15 points. He took NA team twice to the semis. It's just quoting that guy. I have it in text when I read it. And he says, yet he can't do that with the best CIS team. Question mark, question mark, question mark. I know that emoji doesn't show up there. And he says, it's almost like Liquid are talented or something, right? How's Liquid done without s1mple? Yeah, they made a couple of finals for big events, and that's it, basically, in the year and a half since they had s1mple. They didn't qualify for a major twice. Oh, wait a second. Actually, they were in a major, but they bombed out the first one fairly easily, and then they didn't qualify the second time for the major. So Team Liquid without s1mple, and with Mad's money and bringing in multiple other players, haven't really done shit compared to what they did with s1mple. Then he says, yeah, he can't do that with the best CIS team. Right, first of all, it's debatable how much they were the best CIS team once you get to like the middle of this year. So let's say he had the best CIS team for like 9-10 months in Na'Vi, right? First of all, he won a 250k or more tournament with that. Liquid never did that, and he never did that with Liquid. In fact, very few, even great players have won those massive tournaments. Like the first tournament, 250k or more tournament that Guardian won was the one that he won with s1mple as the MVP of the tournament. Now, Are you saying Guardian's not a good player because he, with the best CIS team, couldn't win 250k or more tournaments? No, obviously not. He's a fucking amazing player. It didn't matter that Na'Vi made it to the final majors and 250k tournaments, but didn't win them. That's not really relevant, right? You can't just look at team results and then compare it to the player and compare another team he's in and go, look at that. Oh, I didn't. Different results. Maybe he's the reason why this one's bad, but someone else in the team was the reason they're good. No, it's not really that reasonable, is it, actually? Now, yes, Liquid were talented. Na'Vi's talented as well. And guess what? Liquid sucking dick earlier in this year doesn't mean I'd write off all the players and say it proves they're not talented. Likewise, Na'Vi sucking dick now doesn't mean none of the players are talented, nor does it mean that s1mple sucks in the team and he's the reason why they're not doing it. So I don't really know how that's unreasonable. And in fact, I think the guy's point that he took an NA team to semis in final of major. No other NA team's doing that, by the way. Last time it was Complexity in 2013, the first major. Cloud9 with all their iterations, never done dick like that. Never even made actually semis of a major. Never done anything comparable. And he went to a different culture, different continent, different set of players than he'd ever played with. One time as a stand-in, and he just straight carried these motherfuckers. Yes, they played very well along with that, but he carried in as much as he put the monster superstar numbers, which enabled you to even get to the semis and to the final. So this was from a thread that was about NiKo versus Cold versus s1mple in 250k, so in other words, big events, 250k or more prize pool tournaments. And this guy says 244 points. Easier to get a good rating when you're only ever playing group stages and quarterfinals versus tier 2 teams, right? First of all, this was from 250k or more tournaments. Like, can we just go ahead and throw that out there? It's not like this is when Oscar had godlike stats recently, but you go look at the tournaments. He's playing at like DreamHack Denver. He's playing at DreamHack Winter. He's playing at that ROG EMEA, like European qualifier. Yeah, the entire tournament there is bombs. Like, there's the odd good team, and that's it. The majority of teams are like tier 3, borderline tier 2 in general. That's not what's going on here. These are 250k or more tournaments. So even when he plays bad teams here, it might be the occasional NRG Optic Renegades, but he's still playing a lot against North, Astralis, Cloud9, G2, FaZe, SK. He is still playing the good teams. So the idea that like getting to quarters or semis, because obviously he made semis of Cologne, or just staying in group stage, he's not playing players as bad as this. And in fact, the best way for this 244 points guy to have made his case here would be find another player with stats even vaguely comparable to s1mple in these massive tournaments who's played as many maps or tournaments as s1mple and show us that that guy just played against bombs and got that kind of stat. Now you can't, because s1mple's a mad outlier, and you know the reason he's a mad outlier, because he's able to do this on a bad team at those tournaments against a mixed bag but also some very good teams, and that's why he's this crazy outlier who gets compared to NiKo and s1mple and Cold, just as NiKo himself got compared to Cold last year in similar circumstances. So then this guy, there's another one from that same thread that I'll chuck up there. This guy says, could also say that it is easier to have a good rating when you are the sole star player in a team that plays around you. It goes both ways. Except that it doesn't really, does it, right? Because every player I can give as an example, Shox in 2016 G2. You can think of Stewie2K in Cloud9. You can think of s1mple in this team. You can think of, you know, a bunch of like Kenny S in Titan. Every time you get a player like that, Stewie2K is about pushing the limit. Like, Stewie2K didn't have as good numbers as this. And I'd say actually he had some good players in his teams. He just called the game around himself. So maybe that doesn't count actually. It's actually not that easy to get the good rating. In fact, being the sole player, you'll get a decent rating, but you'll have a lot of games where your team gets their head banged in, get less than 10 kills, and you get the 12 kills. That doesn't help you have amazing stats and amazing ratings, by the way, guys. So, no, it doesn't really when you're the sole player in the team. It might let you get a decent rating, but this notion that it's like a pug where you can just bait everyone and you can get 3 kills out of every 1v4 but lose a 1v4 or save, no, it doesn't really work that way overall, actually. It doesn't really bear out in the stats if you go and compare to other references in history. And then actually, funnily enough, there was a guy in the same thread who made a point that I thought was quite a good counter-argument, actually. So I don't have it here, but basically he just said 52 points he had. Didn't he come like last in Pro League and have the highest rating of any player in the league? So his point there, by the way, if you haven't realized it, yes, it's online Counter-Strike, which is different, but his point there is that just like everyone else in Pro League, he played the exact same number of games against the exact same number of opponents, so there was no difference in field, and yet s1mple ended up with the best stats versus the NiKos, the Device, the fucking Rain, Cardian, Olaf Meister, anyone else, Edren, anyone you want to name, they all played the same number of games, same number of teams as s1mple did, and he ended up with way better stats. That's a pretty good kind of circumstantial piece of evidence to suggest that s1mple's doing it because he's this good, not because he's the sole star player of his team. Right, this is from the thread where people in astonishment posted that s1mple having a 1.52 HLTV rating at DreamHack Winter, where he was the MVP, was the highest of his career. Now, this guy with 14 points says, Tier 2 tournament, ... Now, first of all, just as an aside, people will get mad at shit like that. And yet people will at the same time tell me, why don't you talk about Gambit as a legit chance to win tournaments? Why aren't you putting Mouse Sports top 10? Mouse Sports and Gambit were both at this tournament. So if this is a tier 2 tournament, but they're firmly tier 1 teams in a lot of people's minds, especially Gambit, who some people want as an elite team, well, it has to be one or the other, doesn't it? Either that makes this approaching a tier 1 tournament, or they're not that good and it's a tier 2 tournament, in which case don't criticize me. But this guy, the reason I'm going to bring this up is not his comment entirely. It's just that you wouldn't see this comment in other threads, like about Cold Zero, for example. So what's funny is this tournament, DreamHack Winter, with Gambit and with Mouse Sports, arguably had a better field than CS Summit earlier this year, where SK went practically fucking smurfed. Gambit was the only other good team there. Cloud9 had a stand-in. Team Liquid was in disarray. And Optic also had a stand-in, I believe, at the time. And Nip was going massively downhill and still had Freiburg. So that tournament was very whack. But Cold farmed the fuck out of it. Ended with like 1.0 KPR for the tournament, or something mental like that. One of the biggest differentials I've ever seen between KPR and DPR, deaths per round. An amazing standout performance. And I went and I looked at that thread and I thought, is there a comment like this? Like, well, tier 2 tournament, as if to like downplay his accomplishment. And I went and I looked. No. I found the thread that was about Cold's mad stats at that tournament. Couldn't find any upvoted or comments that even brought up the fact it was a tier 2 tournament. What I'm going to show you, in fact, is this comment. This is a very upvoted comment, 129 points. It said, I know that this event didn't have all the best teams, but how can you say this guy is not the clear number one, in context of this event? Now, what's mad about that is when Cold does amazingly this tournament, I, by the way, personally would have also mentioned, by the way, it was CS Summit, the players weren't as good. But the point is the way people on Reddit treat s1mple versus Cold Zero. Everyone just relished in Cold Zero's accomplishment. They didn't even put in the context. Now, by the way, I do think DreamHack to some degree was a tier 2 tournament. I don't think those teams are that good. I would even mention, the fact his best tournament comes there is not really that great. But the way that people choose to characterize s1mple's accomplishments versus Cold's accomplishments show you half the problem here. So this was from a thread that said, is s1mple the Ibrahimovic, talking about Zlatan Ibrahimovic, of CSGO, famous player for Barcelona and for Inter Milan, now Manchester United. And this guy with 7 points rather, says, difference is that Ibrahimovic never got kicked or forced out in multiple teams because of his attitude. Only at Barca, where he had issues with Pep, the coach of Barcelona at the time, Pep Guardiola. s1mple so far has had issues in pretty much every team he played. Flip side, Hellraisers, he burned a lot of bridges. Now, all I'm going to say about this is an example of a really bad analogy that's actually very unfair when you look at any of the details. Because Ibrahimovic is a very spicy player, certainly someone who's talked a lot of shit and has been, at times, perhaps selfish in some ways. But you know what? Ibrahimovic, at the time this guy's talking about, had played a full football career of 15 years or something. He didn't get to his first really big team, which was Ajax in the Netherlands, and even then not a world-class team necessarily, but a good team, until he was age 20. Now, s1mple, right now, I believe, is either 20 or just turned 21. So, Ibrahimovic, by the time he got to Ajax, was already where s1mple is now, where he already seems a lot more chilled out, had full coaching, had played for, under 20 teams, under 18 teams, played in smaller teams, played in Sweden, done all these things, jumped through all these hoops before he got to a proper team. He'd had experience of being around veteran players who could impart their knowledge. He'd had his experience of being around other skilled players, so he didn't feel like it was just him in the team. s1mple has been in, aside from Hellraisers initially, and now Na'Vi, has been in teams that were much worse than him, that had much worse players than him, that had very flawed players, that were getting to a level, thanks to him, that those players then fell apart on, was with in-game leaders that were sometimes not very good. In terms of Na'Vi most recently was seized, and then obviously Team Liquid with Adren, who obviously never went on to do jack shit afterwards. So I don't think this is a reasonable comparison. Ibrahimovic is a much older man, as you're relating him to, had a lot more experience, was in much better circumstances in practically every team than s1mple's ever been in. So I think it's unreasonable to contrast them this way. Right, this is from the thread back. Some of these are old school ones now. This is one from when s1mple commented on his problems he'd had in Liquid and what he didn't like about it. And basically he'd said stuff like, I missed my family, when they promised I'd be the AWPer, but they brought Kuster in and then wanted him to be the main AWPer. And then this guy here replies to someone who talked about the work environment and says, 80 points. You mean the work environment where they paid him tons of money, paid all expenses to move him around across the world, gave him free room and board, and even kicked a player from their team because s1mple was too toxic to play with him? Or do you mean the work environment where they went out of their way to ease his transition, paid him for English lessons, constantly tried to include him in stuff, and were letting him abandon the team for weeks to go see his family less than 6 months after joining the team? Liquid bent over backwards to make s1mple feel welcomed, but a couple things didn't exactly go his way, so he runs back home to mummy and daddy, same toxic kid he's always been, #old s1mple. Well, let's go through this piece by piece. So you mean the work environment where they paid him tons of money, paid all expenses to move him across the world, gave him free room, right? So the idea they paid him tons of money doesn't mean you can give him a bad work environment, or you can lie to him and tell him one thing, especially about his role in the team, and then make him have a different situation. Then the fact that they paid all his expenses to move him across the world and gave him free room and board, right? They had to do that because he comes from Ukraine. He would have rather stayed in Ukraine and been on Team Liquid and just flown out to the events. Couldn't do that though, because you needed him to play in EPL and ECS to qualify for the LANs. You needed him to be in NA to boot camp with the team. So that's entirely Team Liquid who wanted him in those scenarios. Therefore, yes, they should pay for that. No, that doesn't in any way factor into his work environment having some negatives. Then the way they say is they even kicked a player because s1mple was too toxic to play with him. No, they kicked a player, Adren, because s1mple did not want to play with him. No. Because s1mple made it so that Adren would have quit or be kicked anyway. This is one of the reasons I told Hiko, yes, recruit s1mple to the team. Not only is he an amazing player, superstar player, you can do a lot with him, but he will be the error-correcting virus software, as it were, that will get rid of all the little niggling elements of the team that currently don't flare up as much as they should, but with a player like s1mple, who's going to be so brutal and so upfront about things, that these are going to come to a head and they will then be resolved, or the player will leave. And so most players in that team wanted Adren gone. Most players, as you've seen since, they're not saying, fuck, you know what, the current Team Liquid, started slow, we're having issues, we've got Nigel, fuck, I wish Adren was back here in game leading. Truth is, most of the team didn't want Adren. Some of them were just neutral on it, or some of them didn't want to be the one who pulled the trigger, and so they were willing to let s1mple be the bad guy and let him take the blame. But in order to get what they wanted, their own ends put forward anyways, just s1mple was the means to get to those ends. So it's absolute nonsense that s1mple's the only reason he was kicked. Then when he says the work environment where they went out of their way to ease his transition, paid for English lessons, tried to include him and stuff, right, that's irrelevant, because the fact is, s1mple had a different work environment than every other Team Liquid player. They were all living at home with their families. They didn't have to learn another language. They didn't have to deal with people who culturally they have no experience playing with. They didn't have to play with much worse players than themselves generally. Elige did to some degree, and by the way, as I've referenced already, he kind of showed it himself, his frustrations, in his own way, by being too quiet, by not coming, by kind of giving up mentally in games, by making passive comments behind the backs about people, but then publicly refusing to say things. So no, it's not as simple as just putting it that way, as though like, him and the other teammates, oh, but look at the way he replied to this. No teammate in history has had his scenario like that, where they had to move and do all these things. He was in the toughest situation of any CSGO player in history I've ever been aware of. Because one thing I always big up about CSGO to players and teams from other games is you guys don't know how much harder you have it than CSGO. In CSGO, all the top players, the reason why I can't get some of these top EU players to move to NA, no matter how good the deal is because they want to stay with their family and their girlfriend and live at home and go out with their friends on the one night they have off for the week and then play all the tournaments and still have a chance to be the best in the world and win the major, etc. CSGO has it so easy. s1mple had it very hard. Yes, in the context of like League of Legends, he had it the same as everyone else who's an import player to NA from a country where English isn't the first language. But he had it very differently than most CSGO players. And if you can't be compassionate towards that, that kind of says something about you as a person. Doesn't mean you have to excuse his behavior or say it's good. It wasn't. But to not be able to look at that and say, maybe he was in a difficult situation, kind of bullshit, right? And then the way this guy ends this, a couple of things didn't go his way. No, massive things didn't go his way. He was very unhappy. They couldn't fix that. They weren't in a situation. When, by the way, this guy lies about him repeatedly going away to abandon the team. He went away once. But anyway, this guy says, like, oh, a couple of things didn't go his way. It's something very minor. No, his entire role within the team and how people expected him to play, and then his teammates not liking his attitude, and then he runs back home to mummy and daddy. What a fucking terrible way to describe it. Like, what a cunt you are. Like, I talk shit like that, sure, but guess what? I get the consequences of being called a cunt and being called mean when I do that. So you're not exactly the least toxic person yourself, are they? Same toxic kid he's always been. How do you know? He might be expressing his behaviour in a toxic manner now. Doesn't mean he's the same as he always was. What, you knew him when he was in Flipside? Did he follow his career very closely? Did you? Didn't think so. Hashtag same moron. This is from the same thread. This guy, 43 points, says, sorry, but that is just a lame excuse. It's fine if s1mple rather be with family, but Liquid take no fault in this. He is a pro gamer making substantial money. All he had to do was live in a nice house in a beautiful city with an org that was very welcoming and trying to make him fit in. When I was 18, I moved 2,700 miles away from home for a sport in order to give my dream a real shot and train/compete full time with a great team. I was out there a year, and guess what? I made $0 in salary. I will probably get hate for comparing myself to s1mple, doesn't, got 43 points. But I just have to highlight how not so difficult moving away from home really is, especially when you're doing it for your passion with all the support in the world, community, org, team. This guy isn't meant to be a champion. First of all, fuck this guy and everything he's about, because the first part, okay, where he says he is a pro gamer making substantial money, all he had to do was live in a nice house in a beautiful city with an org that was very welcoming and trying to make him fit in. No, that isn't all he had to do. He had to live, he was making substantial money, okay, cool, playing for a team in a totally different continent and culture. All he had to do was live in a nice house in a beautiful city. No, he had to live in a nice house in a beautiful city on the other side of the world in an entirely different culture without any of his family and friends or even any of his teammates. So not quite the same as that. The org that was very welcoming and trying to make him fit in. The org was. Some of the players in his team, no, absolutely not. And they were actually quite hostile as soon as they found out that they didn't like his attitude, didn't necessarily work with him. Then this guy makes it about himself as though his scenario is anything like s1mple's. So when he was 18, he moved 2,700 miles from home, right? Notice he didn't say he moved to another continent or they didn't speak the language there, totally different culture. He didn't move by himself and with no teammates there. And he didn't move like by himself and in a scenario where no one else was in those circumstances. Doesn't add any of that context. You know why? We can probably speculate wasn't the case at all. He's almost missed all the important circumstantial context. Then he says, I made $0 salary. So what? So having some money in his bank account should have made all these problems cool for s1mple, right? Ah, it's all right. Got money in my bank account. No problem anymore. Why this guy being a fucking loser has got to do with that, I don't know. Then when he says this part about how it's not so difficult, right? Just because you managed it doesn't make it not so difficult. s1mple isn't like you. Other people aren't like you. They don't have the same stressors as you or don't have the same reaction to circumstances. If you somehow were raped, a horrific thing to happen to someone, and you weren't psychologically damaged by it, you were okay with it, or you went through therapy and you got over it, would you go out there to rape support groups and go, you know what are you guys bitching about all the time? I got through it, I was fine. What, you're just so weak, are you? You're not meant to be a strong person. The fact that you just broke down, no, that would be a horrific thing. How lacking compassion do you have to be to go out and do that and tell them, see, it's not so difficult? Or, for example, if you were in a scenario where you were in war, and you came home and you'd killed people and you'd seen friends killed and someone else has PTSD and he's having a really hard time, his life's falling apart, he's spiraled down into drinking, he's lost his family, his job. Would you go, you fucking pussy, you coward? What, you can't handle a bit of war? I was there, I killed a few villagers, so fucking what? It's no big deal, right? What's wrong with you? What, you can't, you're just not meant to be a fucking strong person or a soldier. Like, someone like you should just fucking stay with your mummy and daddy. Like, no, that would be a terrible thing to do, right? There's no compassion whatsoever there. That's the problem a lot of these people who are critics have, is they'll have a point or they'll have a vague piece of analysis that has some merit to it, but they destroy the sentiment of their message by showing that, first of all, in their own way, they're incredibly toxic, like they think s1mple is and are quite a shitty person. And then they also just show they don't understand the basics of his circumstances, yet they're judging him, and they don't have any compassion for them, whether or not they would have reacted the same way or not. Kind of fucked, right? So this was same thread addressing the fact that, well, you just have to read it. It's beautiful, right? So he talks about the fact that in that famous game, Team Liquid against Luminosity, s1mple did that really stupid jump shot at the vents on Cash, and obviously they end up losing the game, and they were up at match point. And that was obviously one of the critical moments that he really fucked up. But it's this second paragraph I want you to read. This is beautiful. This just shows how history itself will show these people to be haters. You don't even need me to actually make these videos to make the point. So as I said, by the way, with the Kenny S and Nico examples, history actually corrects itself because of how great these guys are and how incredibly wrong most people are about their analysis and their judgment of them as people. Being somehow inferior because they don't win Counter-Strike team tournaments as great individual players. So look at the second paragraph. s1mple has shown he is incapable of looking at his play and saying, this is the wrong play. I'm an idiot here. He is the perfect player for T-side entries, but really holds his team back in post plants and on CT side when he does what he wants. I think as far as his team is concerned, they lose some firepower in the immediate future, but probably end up much better off if Kusta can step up his game to the projected potential. First of all, last sentence. Yeah, Team Liquid, it really worked out a lot better for them, didn't it? And Kusta, good old Kusta, when he was finally left without s1mple, how did it work out? Oh, that's right, yeah, nothing. Yeah, in fact, no NA player wants to play with him except for the shitters. Weird that, isn't it? Must be s1mple again. The ghost of s1mple must be in their ears all the time, being toxic, tell them not to play with him. Right, and funnily enough, Kusta himself gave up the AWP and thought that Ricky should AWP, even though, as FNS told us, even though s1mple wasn't there to be like, drop the AWP, bitch, I want this weapon, you are shit. No, it wasn't that why he did it. But anyway, look at the first part of the paragraph. s1mple has shown he's incapable of looking at his play. See, he is and then he says that he really holds his team back in post plants and CT side. What's great is, in the last few months where s1mple's been going supernova, when you watch him in Na'Vi, he wins tons of clutches, not the best clutch player in the world, but pretty good. He's amazing on CT side with that aggressive style of play. As I've referenced, comparing him to Fur before, both incredible players at this constant aggression, and actually both do a lot for their team as a result. They make them have amazing CT halves and open up the game massively for their teammates as a result, with comms, with kills, with punching a hole in the offense, so they have to regroup, and it allows certain timings for rotations for the CTs, funnily enough. Then you've got to consider that this guy's entire analysis was just proven wrong just by having more sample size, more data to watch of him in other teams and playing more. He's actually developed that style into arguably the best at that style ever in CSGO. So the idea that it was flawed and he had to come back from that, nonsense. And then when he says, like, s1mple can't think this is the wrong play, I'm an idiot here, that's cause only you're the idiot if you do that. If you or I or anyone else normal does that play, you're an idiot. s1mple's going for something. s1mple has a style of play which can only be suited to his strengths and mentality as a player. And guess what? This year, to some degree, he perfected that style. I'd agree in 2015, 2016, he was extremely good, but there were a lot of holes in his game. There was a lot of flaws. He actually took this and he didn't correct it and become an ABC, very safe player. He went down this aggressive route and he mastered the powers of the dark side to become a Sith Lord, and now is fucking amazing at that aggressive style of play, much better than he or practically any kind of passive player is, beyond maybe coldzera. And coldzera's never played in a team as bad as Na'Vi currently is right now, so I don't really know what coldzera would be like under those circumstances. This is the last one. It's from where s1mple had left Team Liquid. It's got 1,025 points. And it just says, how to throw away success 101 with special guest s1mple. Now, after s1mple left Team Liquid have never done as well at a major. Their best result, final of a 250k or more tournament at ESL in New York, arguably worse than their best result with s1mple. Then you go and look at s1mple. s1mple's a player where he actually accomplished something better since then. He won a 250k or more tournament. He made legends at majors again. He was in a position where he actually, after Liquid, if you remember, went to that worst players team and was so fucking good, surrounded by tier 2 and tier 3 CIS talent, coming like 4th at the event, that it immediately put him back on everyone's radar that fucking hell, this guy's amazing, even with really shit players. Then he got back into Team Liquid, went to the finals of the major with them, best result they've ever had. Then he got into Na'Vi as a result of it. Now, in Na'Vi, yeah, he initially had a spike of results and had not really much worse because he had more tournaments in Na'Vi than he did in Liquid, but now has had worse results, yes, but is now still primed in position where he's signed with Na'Vi. He's got Electronic now. Zeus has come back. Odds are they might not be good now. They're a decent to good team, but give this guy 6 years to a month, 6 months to a year rather, and odds are he will be in an amazing position, much, much better than he ever could have been as this like super sub for Liquid, or as someone having to live on the other side of the world in Liquid. And so I get why this guy said it here, because it looked like, what's he going to do? No CIS team wants him, he can't get into Na'Vi. But you know what? History's kind of proven that to be a bit of a silly comment.
Hey, I'm Hiko, the Master Baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.